I'm Sharon Stone. This is Engage. America is marking its 250th anniversary this year. On Engage, we're bringing you weekly conversations from our community, exploring what that milestone means from a Central Florida perspective. For centuries, people have come to Florida, looking beyond the horizon. Indigenous people navigated its waterways. European explorers crossed oceans to reach its shores. Today, astronauts launch from our space coast to destinations beyond Earth. While many conversations about America's founding focus on the original 13 colonies, historian Ben Brotemarkle says Florida's story of exploration goes back long before the United States existed.
I think exploration really starts earlier than that. People have been living here for 15,000 years, and those people came across the Bering Strait during the Ice Age, we believe, and made their way down into Florida. So they walked all across North America until they came to Florida. And we have a fascinating history of indigenous people here. Back then, Florida was 3 times wider than it is now. So a lot of these sites where people lived are now in the Gulf of Mexico. We know that there's sites there that have been found underwater now, as well as all the great archaeology that's going on land. So I would say that exploration really started with those first people in Florida.
How should we think about the people who were already here before the Europeans started arriving?
At the time of European contact in the 1500s, there were literally dozens of different tribal groups, sophisticated tribal groups with complex cultures living here. There were the Appalachee up in the Panhandle who were great farmers, and they built a council house that could hold more than 1,000 people. There were the Calusa in Southwest Florida, who were a very powerful warrior tribe who demanded tributes from other tribes throughout Florida. And the Tequesta, they had a big city at the mouth of the Miami River. So there are, like I say, dozens of these tribes speaking different languages, different religious beliefs. By the time the Europeans came, there was a lot of European contact once it started. Primarily the Spanish, of course. Juan Ponce de Leon gave our state its name in 1513, but he was not successful at establishing a permanent European settlement here. He tried. He came back in 1521, but was repelled by the Calusa. They were kind of ready for him and mortally wounded him, even though he had brought a bunch of settlers and livestock and all sorts of things. There were other attempts after him. Probably the closest was Don Tristan de Luna up in what is now Pensacola in 1559. He brought all of these ships into Pensacola Bay. 1,500 settlers was going to establish a colony, but was not expecting a hurricane. We didn't have newscasters, warning us weeks in advance that something might be coming. And so all of his ships sunk in Pensacola Bay. So a few years later, the French came, first in 1562, and then in 1564, they established Fort Caroline in what's the Jacksonville area. And of course, the Spanish were very unhappy about this because they had claimed La Florida, as they called it, which was at that time most of the southeastern United States, really. They claimed that as Spanish territory. So they weren't happy about the French settlement. On top of that, they were Protestant Huguenots. And the Spanish, of course, were Roman Catholic. So they saw these French not only as invaders, but as heretics. And so they sent Don Pedro Menendez de Avilés to Florida to wipe out the French, which he did. And he was the one who established the first permanent European settlement in what is now the United States at St. Augustine. Later, we had British. The British controlled Florida. We're celebrating America 250. And for the entire period of the American Revolution, from 1763 to 1783, the British controlled Florida. It was a loyalist stronghold for British loyal to the king to come to Florida to escape from the colonies to the north if they didn't want to participate in the American Revolution. After the revolution ended, Florida was turned back over to the Spanish. And as the late, great Florida historian Mike Gannon used to say, it'll be the year 2056 before an American flag has flown over Florida longer than a Spanish flag. But eventually, of course, Florida did become a United States territory in 1821 and a state in 1845. So that's when the Florida crackers, mostly people of Scott-Irish descent, started coming down from Georgia and the Carolinas and settling Florida.
When we talk about the people who settled and shaped Florida over the centuries, where do people of African descent fit into the story?
Well, interestingly, people of African descent were among the first non-indigenous people to set foot in Florida. Every one of those Spanish ships that came in the 1500s and 1600s had people of African descent on board. The Spanish had a much different system of slavery than the British did. The Spanish, as awful as it was, their slavery was not race-based, and you could work yourself out of that situation. So there were many people of African descent, some free. They weren't all enslaved that came with the Spanish. There were people that were very valued crew members. Juan Garrido was one of the first, who was a person of African descent to come to Florida. And they were scouts and guides and translators and very valued crew members. And beyond that, I mean, Florida has always been kind of a haven for people of African descent. Fort Mose was established in 1738 as the first legally sanctioned black settlement in what would become the United States. It was set up to protect St. Augustine. It's just north of St. Augustine. And so it was the first line of defense for British coming into Spanish Florida. The town of Eatonville, was the first incorporated African-American municipality in the United States, certainly one of the first, entirely governed by African Americans, and it was established in 1887. So people of African descent, like all of these other folks we've been talking about, from the indigenous people and all the different Europeans, also came to Florida seeking a new life, exploring, if you will, a new life and discovering a different way of living. In the Seminole Wars of the 1800s, people of African descent who were enslaved would escape into Florida and join the Seminole people. There's a whole group of Black Seminoles who were, again, valued members of the tribal groups here in Florida.
So it sounds like Florida wasn't just a place that people were moving through. It was a place that people built lives. Is that fair?
Absolutely. We've been talking about Florida as a catalyst for exploration, but it was also the people who came here exploring often found what they were looking for and established permanent settlements here and permanent communities that many of which still exist today.
Florida is showing up again and again on the edge of the unknown. My question to you is, why Florida? What made this place a gateway?
Its location geographically was very important to Europeans, especially the British, who were trying to control North America. We think of the 13 colonies when we're talking about early America, but of course, Florida were the 14th and 15th colonies, because the British broke it into East Florida with the capital in St. Augustine and West Florida with the capital in Pensacola. From the British perspective, Florida was a very strategic place. We also have the Gulf Stream, which allowed ships to catch that Gulf Stream and propel them to Europe. So it was an important trade route for the indigenous people and others that came after. Florida's kind of the last place to go. I mean, it's at the hanging off the end of the United States, and there you can't go any further. So from the indigenous people all the way to people going to Key West looking for a different, type of lifestyle, that's as far as you can go.
When we were talking about Florida's history, from the indigenous people navigating the waterways to the Spanish explorers you were talking about crossing the oceans, and I want to talk to you more about just astronauts launching from the Space Coast, but do you see just a common thread in all of these explorers?
I think that it's just human nature to explore and to discover and go as far as you can. And all of these people had different motivations for that, but I think it's almost like a primal thing for all human beings.
So a reason that this idea resonated with me is because of how much we cover the Space Coast. When we're thinking about this conversation in Florida history, I'm noticing a comparison between people launching themselves into the unknown from this peninsula for centuries to astronauts launching themselves into the unknown for Florida. Is that kind of a fair comparison?
I think so. I think that that same spirit of exploration that brought people here walking across a continent to get to Florida, and then the Europeans, mostly the Spanish, but also the French and the British, setting sail, not knowing what exactly they were going to find. That imagine the spirit that must take to get on a boat and then travel across the ocean, not even knowing what you were going to hit. The first explorations into space had that same kind of faith, in exploration, because the computers on those first Apollo missions weren't as complicated as what's in your cell phone. I mean, we carry around in our pocket more sophisticated computer power than they had on those original manned missions into space. So it takes a lot of spirit, a lot of passion for discovery and exploration to be one of the first people that comes here, one of the Europeans that sail here, and the people that get on those ships and get blasted into space. Every important manned mission into space has been launched from right here from Florida at Cape Canaveral. And it's so interesting, I think, because Cape Canaveral is one of the earliest European place names on any map. And so that shows that end of exploration. And then it's also the site of all of our manned exploration and launches into space. It's just an incredible kind of bookends of this period of exploration for human beings. Really an amazing time.
Ben Brotemarkle is Executive Director of the Florida Historical Society and host of their weekly show, Florida Frontiers, that airs Thursday nights at 6:30 on Central Florida Public Media. Engage is a production of Central Florida Public Media. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. Richard Copeland is our senior producer. I'm Sharon Stone. You can reach us anytime with questions, comments, or story ideas. Send an email to engage@cfpublic.org. Thanks for listening.